Thank you everyone for being here. This is my dissertation defense titled Measuring the Immeasurable, Perspectives on Best Practices when Operationalizing Machine Learning Fairness for Recommender Systems. I'm Jess. This dissertation has been about 7 years in the making. And 7 years ago, when I started this work, I started as a positivist, which means I believed that reality is objective and that it can be observed, measured, and understood through scientific methods. Now I think of myself as more of an interpretivist, which means I believe that reality is inherently subjective and knowledge is constructed through social and individual experiences. And this has informed my dissertation work heavily because while I used to be a quantitative researcher, all the studies in this dissertation are qualitative research. And I'll get to those studies in just a second. Here's a roadmap of where I'm going to be taking us. But first, I'm going to begin with some motivation and background on this work. The following story that I'm about to share is a fictionalized composite of many different stories. So while the people that I'm about to describe aren't real, their stories are. This is Ebba. She's been writing and producing her own music for about 10 years. And several years ago, she decided to finally start posting her music online on a streaming platform in hopes of turning her passion into her career. But after years of painstaking work, she has experienced little to no success on this platform to no fault of her own. She sees a lot of other artists who are posting very similar music to hers, and they are achieving a lot of success and getting a lot of attention from the algorithm, but she isn't, and she doesn't know why that is. She feels that she's being treated unfairly by this algorithm, and she's starting to wonder if she should pursue this career at all. This is Caitlin. She's a data scientist at the music streaming company that hosts Ebba's music. And recently she started to wonder if maybe she should do a fairness evaluation of her system to see if anyone is being treated unfairly. After months of back and forth with higher ups, she finally convinces them to allow her to conduct a fairness evaluation. But she has to volunteer her time outside of her normal book of work to do this. She quickly becomes overwhelmed as the papers pile up on her desk, and she feels lost for where to begin. She feels undertrained and unsupported and has no idea how to conduct a fairness evaluation or even interpret or act upon those results once it's done. Frustrated, after months of work, she decides to give up. It can't be that bad, can it? Meanwhile, with little to no success online, Ebba decides that she should stop trying to turn her music into her career. She decides to give up sharing her music with the world. So in this scenario, Caitlin's lack of support perpetuated an unfair experience for Ebba. If Caitlin had been more supported to evaluate fairness, she might have learned about people like Ebba and helped them find the success that they deserve. So how could this have been avoided? Let's begin with measurement. Ken Alder once said, "Measures are more than a creation of society. They create society." And I believe that society influences technology, and technology equally influences society. So the way that we design technology is our opportunity to create the kind of world that we want to live in. And measurement is one of our human ways to observe, understand, and improve the world around us, because as the adage goes, you can't change what you can't measure. Galileo also said, "Measure what is measurable and make measurable what is not so." The idea here was basically measure everything that we possibly can in the world, even if it's immeasurable. Now, of course, Galileo wanted us to try to observe and measure everything around us. He was one of the pioneers of the scientific method. And this quote really emphasizes this long-standing belief in the scientific field that if we can observe and measure something, we can truly understand it. And through that understanding, we can progress science, society, and our lives. But not everything is measurable. And we've attempted to measure these immeasurable things, like pain, whether it be through brain scans to see if C fibers are firing in our brain or through subjective surveys, like the one that you see on the screen. We've attempted to quantify this subjective experience. But my pain is not the same as your pain. And your pain is not the same as mine. And no matter how hard we try, we cannot reduce this complex human experience to a number. The same is true with happiness. Whether through the World Happiness Report or Gallup's Wellbeing Index, We've taken a combination of survey data on human satisfaction, on people's trust of their government, on GDP per capita, and we've attempted to quantify how happy people are in their communities and their countries. But this number will never fully capture the complex human experience of what it means to be happy. And we haven't stopped at happiness and pain. In more recent years, and especially in the field of computer science, we've attempted to measure the complex construct of fairness. And before I describe how we've tried to measure fairness, I'm first going to describe what fairness is, because it is very tricky to define. It is this intuitive gut feeling that we have all experienced, whether we have felt that we are being treated unfairly or we've seen people being treated unfairly around us. It's this feeling of maybe I can't define it, but I will know it when I see it. And that intuition is influenced by our personal lives and our cultural upbringing. At a high level, fairness is when we justifiably distribute resources, opportunities, benefits, or harms. And I say justifiably here because there is no right or wrong way to be fair. Since it's subjective and philosophical, and what I think is fair is maybe not what you think is fair, there is no right or wrong here. We've likely seen fairness in practice through frameworks like equality and equity, where equality seeks to give everyone equal opportunities, as shown on the left, and equity recognizes that not everyone starts off on the same playing field, and some people need more support than others. So this seeks to give equal outcomes, as shown on the right. Now, since fairness is a theoretical construct, you can't directly observe or measure it. But in the field of computer science and in the domain of machine learning specifically, we have tried our best to measure it in practice. One popular method to measure this in practice is through what's called disaggregated evaluations. This is when we assess if a system has performance disparities between multiple groups of people. So for example, you might see if a facial recognition software has higher accuracy for white people than Black people, or you might see if a hiring algorithm has higher error rates for women versus men. And the most famous example of a disaggregated evaluation in practice was the case of the COMPASS algorithm. Raise your hand if you've heard of this example before. Everyone in the department. Nice. Some people outside of the department. That's cool. So NorthPoint was a company that created the algorithm called COMPASS, which was a recidivism risk algorithm. So it would predict someone's likelihood of recommitting a crime. The higher the risk score, the higher likelihood you had of recommitting a crime, at least according to the algorithm. ProPublica is an investigative journalism nonprofit, and they came in and performed a disaggregated evaluation on this algorithm, and they discovered that it was disproportionately giving higher risk scores to Black people who were actually low risk, and disproportionately giving low risk scores to white people who were actually high risk. Now, since their definition of fairness was that all false negative and false positive rates should be roughly equal between offenders of all races, they called out NorthPoint and said this algorithm is not fair. NorthPoint, however, countered, and they said that their fairness definition was that all true positive and true negative rates should be roughly equal between offenders of all races. And so according to their definition, the algorithm was fair. So this example just showcases how there is no right or wrong way to define fairness, but the way that we define it has real impacts on real people. So even if there's not a right or wrong way, there are better or worse ways depending on the context. And there are dozens of ways that we can define fairness in practice, and dozens of ways that we can implement it as objectives in a machine learning system. Now, this process of defining, measuring, and incorporating fairness into machine learning systems is what we call operationalizing fairness. And I'll be using this language a lot during this defense. So I was curious in this work what it would look like to operationalize fairness for a specific domain of machine learning. And this was in part because fairness is so context specific, I wanted to ground my observations for a specific domain. So I chose the case study of recommender systems. Now, we've all likely interacted with recommender systems in our everyday lives. These are highly complex combinations of algorithmic subsystems, whether it be through Netflix movie recommendations or TikTok or Instagram video recommendations or news recommendations or even Google search results. These systems are prolific in our digital lives. And there are three key stakeholders of recommender systems that I focus on in this dissertation. First, we have the providers. the people who provide items to be recommended, like content creators or sellers on Amazon and Etsy, or a musician on Spotify. And their vested interest is to have their items exposed fairly to the audiences they feel they deserve. Then you have the organization and the people who develop these algorithms. Their vested interest is to make money, to keep the business afloat, and to make sure that they don't have any PR concerns. And then you have the item consumers, the people like you and me, who consume the recommended items. Fairness in recommendation is typically most concerned with provider-side fairness or consumer-side fairness. I'll give two examples of provider-side fairness now. So on a platform like GoFundMe, you might ask questions like, are we fairly recommending funding requests for people who need funding, or are we systematically underserving certain kinds of borrowers? On a platform like YouTube, you might ask, are we fairly recommending videos from BIPOC content creators, or are we systematically underserving this population of providers? I'll now give two examples of consumer-side fairness. On a news recommendation platform, we might ask, are we fairly representing the information space, or are we disproportionately recommending news from right-wing news outlets or left-wing news outlets? Or on a platform like LinkedIn, we might ask, are we fairly recommending high-paying jobs to women, or are we only recommending secretarial jobs to women and C-suite level jobs to men? Now, these fairness concerns are incredibly challenging to measure in practice. And this is in part because although there are many fairness toolkits that have been created to try to help practitioners with this effort, they report that they aren't helpful because their system, their users, their data, and their workflows are so specific to their context. And although there are many fairness metrics, mathematical definitions and formalizations of fairness that have been introduced in literature that practitioners can use to evaluate fairness, they aren't sure which of these metrics they should choose for their context. On top of this, there are also many business constraints that shape how fairness work is done in practice. And practitioners report that they lack the power that they need to make decisions. They lack access to the data that they need to conduct disaggregated evaluations. And they often have to try to convince their higher ups to allow them to do this work in the first place because of this belief that fairness work runs counter to business incentives. And this is in part because of this longstanding belief that people also think that in order for us to improve the fairness of a machine learning system, we have to necessarily decrease its accuracy, which isn't always the case, by the way. In addition, the people who are actually impacted by unfairness, the users, are rarely involved in the process of this evaluation, despite the fact that they are the ones who are most impacted and implicated by this operationalization. So all of this makes this incredibly complex decision-making landscape where there is no right or wrong way to measure fairness. There's no way to achieve or ensure fairness, and yet we aren't in a philosophy classroom. And philosophizing will only get us so far. In the real world, decisions must still be made. So 5.5 years ago, I sought out to try to understand how are these decisions made? How can these decisions be made? And how should these decisions be made? And this brings me to the 3 pillars of my dissertation work: the user's perspective, the practitioner's perspective, and the expert's perspective. Users in my dissertation are anyone who interacts with the recommender system or who might be impacted by that system. So this includes people like I defined earlier, providers and consumers. Providers are people like content creators, musicians, sellers, borrowers. Consumers are people like you and me. We consume the recommendations. Practitioners are industry professionals who work with and around machine learning technologies. And this can include technical practitioners like machine learning engineers and data scientists. It can also include non-technical practitioners like managers and employees who simply influence the design of a machine learning ecosystem in some way. And finally, experts. These are the people who have years of experience working with machine learning fairness topics. And this can include practitioners who have contributed to machine learning fairness in real-world settings, or academics who have published peer-reviewed papers on machine learning fairness. And I will note that some of the experts in my study are practitioners, but not all the practitioners in my dissertation are machine learning fairness experts. So each of these perspectives targets an overarching research question that I have for this dissertation. For the user's perspective, I wanted to know, how do users think that fairness should be operationalized in real-world recommender systems? From practitioners, I wanted to know what do they need when operationalizing fairness in real-world recommender systems. And for the experts' perspective, I wanted to know what they thought the best practices were for evaluating fairness in the real world while keeping practical constraints in mind. This dissertation includes 5 studies, and 2 for the user's perspective, 2 for the practitioners, 1 for the experts. I did want to note that I'll be spending the bulk of this defense on studies 2 and 5 because those are the ones I've completed since my proposal and the ones that the committee has heard the least about. Here's a brief overview of each of those studies. I conducted 3 interview studies, 1 interview and iterative design study, and 1 focus group study. And in total, this dissertation includes the stories from over 100 people. I now turn to those stories. Starting with the user's perspective. I wanted to know, how do users think fairness should be operationalized in the real world? This first study was a formative study that I conducted during my first year of my PhD. And the goal here was to understand how end users think fairness should be incorporated and explained to them in recommendation systems. This was a semi-structured interview study with 30 end users of recommender systems. And the major takeaways here were that we learned end users do want to be told when fairness might impact their personalized recommendations and why. And this was in part because the users in our study expressed that they had a greater trust for the fairness goals from a nonprofit organization than they would from the fairness goals of a for-profit organization. I also learned that the end users in our study cared about provider-side fairness once they were educated about what it was, because many of them had never heard of it before. And these end users also described that they were willing to sacrifice some personalization accuracy for the sake of improving fairness for providers. Now onto my second study. I'm going to spend a little bit more time on this one. So this was also targeting the user's perspective, but specifically the provider's perspective. So this was a focus group study with dating app users and content creators. And I wanted to know what would happen if we try to design fairness metrics with the people who experience unfairness. I conducted 4 focus groups with 13 participants. The first 2 groups were with content creators. The second 2 groups were with dating app users. And during the focus groups, I led participants through this journey of describing their experiences of unfairness on these platforms that they use, and then translating those experiences onto fairness goals that would capture and alleviate that experience, and eventually definitions and metrics that would capture the original experience. To analyze my data, I conducted reflexive thematic analysis, which involved inductive open coding of transcripts, where I turned those codes into noticeable patterns and eventually higher level themes. I'll now turn to those themes in the form of the 3 research questions I had for the study, and I'll go through each one by one. So the first research question here was, what are the lived experiences of unfairness for content creators and dating app users? I quickly learned that the participants in my study had experiences of unfairness that were subjective and amorphous, which is why participant 1 said for them, it's hard to say what is unfair, just what feels unfair. And this was the first time I began to wonder, maybe there's a difference between these theoretical notions of fairness that we have, like equity and equality of opportunity that we optimize systems for, versus people's lived experiences and feelings. And I'll get to this theme again in just a minute. I also learned from content creators that they were concerned about their content being underexposed on the platform and not reaching the audience they felt it deserved. And this aligned with previous work that describes popularity bias, this idea where very few people benefit and achieve success in a system and receive attention from the algorithm, while the vast majority of people in the system achieve little to no success or attention. They also described how they felt their content had been unfairly banned or suppressed without any explanation as to why and without any ability to correct this. Now, in contrast, the dating app users in my study described that they were more concerned about overexposure and their profile being inaccurately exposed to the wrong audiences. And this was because if it was exposed to the wrong people, they were worried they might be subject to toxic messaging or hate speech or feelings of unsafety. And some participants had experienced this before. I will note that outside of this study, I've informally talked to many dating app users over the years, and I know some people who have the opposite concern. They're concerned with their profile not reaching enough people. So I think whether or not somebody's concerned with over or underexposure is really due to their personal lived experience, and we can't make a generalization here. The second research question of this study was, what fairness goals, definitions, and metrics do these providers want to alleviate their experiences of unfairness? As I mentioned before, in these focus groups, I took the participants through this process of translating their experiences onto fairness concerns, and then translating those concerns into goals to alleviate the concern, and eventually definitions and metrics to capture that concern. I'll give an example of this now. From participant 4, who was a content creator, they felt that they unfairly had their content suppressed and banned. So they came up with the fairness goals of exposure consistency and transparency around policies, especially content revoking reasoning. Their fairness definition was to provide equal opportunity for all users to be seen, and they developed an exposure equality metric that directly translated and captured their original experience of unfairness. And this was true for all the participants in this study. They all created metrics that directly captured their lived experience, even if they didn't translate to formal notions of fairness. The third research question of this study was, what are some of the opportunities and challenges of designing fairness metrics with providers? First and foremost, this study reinforced for me that not everyone's fairness needs can be met at once in a system. And an example of this came up in one of the dating app focus groups, where me and the participants were discussing a way to potentially improve racial discrimination on a dating app. And one way we thought to do this was to maybe increase the diversity of recommendations. So to recommend more people of color on the app. Well, we also thought that if we did this, if we were to recommend those people to people who have racially discriminatory dating preferences, we open up those people who we are recommending to possible toxic, hateful messaging and feelings of unsafety. So this intervention would only work if everyone on the platform was open-minded and kind to others, which unfortunately is just not the world that we live in. So this is an example of how, in an effort to make things more fair, we can actually accidentally cause more harm. And participant 7 described this well. They said a lot of times one of these things that could benefit one group can harm another group, and it's hard to balance those. Another concern brought up by participants was that developers could take these metrics as the final step, and as long as they could keep one certain numerical metric satisfied, they wouldn't care to put resources towards more subjective or qualitative experiences of unfairness, like these focus groups. So they might treat metrics as the goal instead of treating people's experiences as the goal. Some other implications of this study are, first, I do believe that this is a promising method for designing metrics in a way that better capture people's day-to-day experiences. And I think future work would benefit from putting some of these metrics into practice to assess their efficacy and usability. I also learned that under and overexposure are both fairness concerns that might be in tension with one another. And I see a lot in previous literature in the recommendation field that people always assume that providers want more exposure of their items, but that's not always the case. And by assuming that, we might accidentally cause more harm. I also learned that there are concerns that are not just fairness-based for my participants. For example, many participants in this study said that if the system was more transparent for them, they would feel that it was more fair, even if it wasn't. And this notion of transparency does not actually translate directly to any traditional fairness frameworks. And finally, I started to learn that there are two ways to measure and enact fairness in a system. And this is theoretical notions of fairness versus perceptions and lived experiences of fairness. And I think there are limitations of both of these approaches, which I'll discuss in more detail when I get to study number 5. So in summary, from the user's perspective, how do users think that fairness should be operationalized in real-world recommender systems? My answer is, it depends on the user, the system, and the context. But I learned from the users in my studies that they would like to be involved in this process so that their needs and lived experiences can be included. Now I will move on to the practitioner's perspective. This is study number 3 and 4, and I wanted to know, what do practitioners need when operationalizing fairness in real-world recommender systems? Starting with study number 3, this was a semi-structured interview study with 23 employees at Kiva. And also, raise of hands, sorry, it's the teacher in me. Who's heard of Kiva? Most people, nice. Okay, for those who have not, Kiva is a nonprofit organization that uses microlending to provide access to capital for individuals who are financially underserved. So it's kind of like GoFundMe or Kickstarter for people who don't have access to bank accounts or credit cards or traditional lending services, but they maybe need funding for expenses like living expenses or personal projects that they're working on. And when you go to the Kiva website, on the homepage, you are immediately shown many recommendations for borrowers to fund. Now, these recommendations are very important because previous work has shown that the higher up that a borrower is in the recommendation list, the more likely they are to receive funding. And on Kiva, if you don't receive your full funding request within 30 days, your loan is taken off the website. So there's a lot of fairness implications here for who should show up higher in recommendation lists and who's deserving of that funding. So we wanted to know how Kiva employees enact fairness in recommendations through their work. And we discovered 4 fairness logics or patterns of practice that these employees implicitly aligned their work with to enact fairness. I'll go through 3 of these as an example. So the contract-based logic was rooted in social contract theory and the framework of equality of opportunity. The idea here is that everyone should have a fair chance to receive benefits from the system. So if we wanted to enact this on Kiva, we would focus on prioritizing recommending loans from people who are underserved globally, like women. In contrast, the character-based logic is rooted in Aristotle's theory of virtue ethics. So the idea here is that decisions should be based on a person's character rather than their actions. And at Kiva, you would enact this if you focus on personalization, because then lenders get to make choices based on their own personal biases of who they think is deserving of a loan. And this might be based on things like somebody's profile picture or their bio on the website. There was also the consequence-based logic rooted in act utilitarianism, where the idea is to maximize positive impact and minimize negative impact. It's a numbers game. And the idea here is that on Kiva, if you recommend high impact loans or recommend low risk loans, like those that are likely to be repaid, then you would enact this logic. But we did quickly learn that there's a tension in this logic because it's very hard to both maximize impact and minimize risk. And so trying to grapple with that tension and keep the marketplace alive was going to prioritize the organization as a whole. So that was one of our biggest takeaways from this work, is that we learned that each of these logics prioritize certain stakeholders over others. And Kiva employees were implicitly prioritizing these stakeholders by enacting these logics. And so they could benefit from greater guidance to help them explicitly make these decisions in the future. Now on to my 4th study, the practitioner's perspective as well. This was an interview and iterative design study with 15 machine learning practitioners at Spotify. And the goal here was to understand what these practitioners need to select fairness metrics that match their fairness goals. The motivation here was that there are dozens of fairness metrics that practitioners can choose from when they're trying to evaluate fairness, but they say in the literature and previous research that they don't know which of these fairness metrics to choose in practice because they also don't know how to scope their fairness goals in a way that translates to that mathematical formalization. So we tried to create that guidance. I'm not going to go too in depth here. I'm just going to gloss over this. I know you can't actually read what's on the screen, but this is an example of the decision tree that we created through extensive literature review and feedback from these practitioners. And the goal here was to help them scope their amorphous subjective fairness goal into a concrete fairness metric that they could use from the literature to capture that goal empirically. And one of our biggest takeaways from this work was that we learned practitioners need more guidance about how to choose between equally applicable or appropriate fairness metrics, because in the decision tree, there were many branches they could have gone down that felt equally appropriate for their given context, but would have resulted in a very different evaluation result. So in summary, from the practitioners, what did they need when operationalizing fairness in real-world recommender systems? I learned that they need more guidance about which fairness metrics align with their goals. They need more guidance to understand how certain evaluation and system designs might prioritize certain stakeholders over others. And they need more guidance about how to choose between equally appropriate evaluation approaches and system designs. And now onto the final perspective, final study and final research question of this dissertation. What are the potential best practices for operationalizing fairness in the real world while keeping practical constraints in mind? This was a semi-structured interview study with 21 machine learning fairness experts from industry and academia. And I recruited them through a combination of convenience and snowball sampling. During these interviews, we discussed current practices for evaluating fairness and how these experts thought that those practices could and should be improved. Similarly to study 2, to analyze the data, I performed reflexive thematic analysis, which involved several rounds of inductive open coding and categorizing those codes into data themes, topics, and stories. So I'll turn again to those themes. There were 3 research questions in this study too. Starting with research question 1, I wanted to know how these machine learning fairness experts conceptualize fairness. So now I'll return to that tension that I brought up during study number 2, this tension between system level theoretical notions of fairness and individual perceptions and lived experiences of unfairness. The participants in this study defined system level theoretical fairness as mathematical formulations of high-level concepts of fairness. And this could involve measuring things like unwanted system bias, or measuring how diverse items are in the system, or trying to measure equity or equality of opportunity for provider groups in the system as a whole. So the idea here was that this theoretical notion of fairness would capture if the system as a whole was fair or unfair, through certain criteria like, are songs from female artists being recommended as much as songs from male artists? And I will note one limitation of this approach is that it is not always perceptible to the user. So even if we did measure that our system recommended male artists more than females, and we tried to improve that disparity by 0.5%, that improvement would not be perceptible to someone's day-to-day life. So this was a noted critique of this formalization. And participant 9 said, if we optimize for some academic notion of fairness that does not correspond to the way the community itself thinks about fairness, then what have we really done? This participant in particular made me really question the value of this approach. I began to wonder if we are evaluating and optimizing a system for this theoretical conceptualization of what fairness is supposed to mean, but people still think that they are being treated unfairly, then what is the point of doing this work? This brings me to the second conceptualization brought up by participants, which is individual perceptions of fairness. And participants describe this as people's personal experiences or their gut feeling of whether or not they were being treated fairly. So this is all about, or it's less about targeting fairness thresholds and baselines, and it's instead about trying to evaluate a system based on what is meaningful to users in their day-to-day lives, even if those evaluations and interventions don't align with traditional notions of fairness. I will note, though, that one participant critiqued this approach. Well, several did in other ways, but this participant said, users feeling like they are being treated fairly is not the same thing as fairness. It's user satisfaction. And this participant especially made me question my own biases in favor of this approach, because intuitively to me, I felt like this approach was maybe more aligned with people's lived experiences, day-to-day lives, and might be more meaningful. But on the other hand, I also heard from many participants that people's lived experiences are incredibly subjective and often very selfish, because even if people are claiming that what they want is fairness, often in practice, what they actually want is what benefits them, even if it's at the cost of others, and even if they don't actually deserve that benefit. So I'll get to a little bit more about this tension in just a minute when I describe the implications and lessons of this dissertation as a whole. But for now, I'll go on to research question 2 of the study, which was what constraints arise in machine learning fairness evaluations within industry, and how do they influence decision-making? There were 3 constraints brought up by participants that influence decision-making in industry. I'm going to go through each of these and describe what they are, and then I'll provide an example of how practitioners work within this constraint to still try to conduct a successful fairness evaluation in industry. So first, in industry, practitioners often have to balance competing interests, such as the interests of various teams across the organization. And participant 13 described that if you do not own the model, there's not much you can do without having support of the modeling team, because the fairness evaluation team needs to gain access to the model, which means they need to collaborate with modeling teams. However, modeling teams have very different incentives than fairness evaluation teams. Modeling teams are incentivized to move quickly, push products quickly, and innovate quickly, while fairness evaluation teams benefit from slowing things down and doing their due diligence to make sure that they're not deploying a system that has the potential to cause harm. Since fairness evaluation is almost always a lower priority than shipping models at organizations, this also means that the fairness evaluation team has to work within the timelines and budgets and workflows of the modeling teams, which are heavily subject to change. Participants described working within this constraint by optimizing fairness with respect to a business baseline to appease the needs of the modeling teams. So for example, participant 10 said they maximize fairness subject to a constraint of not dropping performance more than X%. So they think of the performance metrics as the constraint as opposed to thinking of fairness metrics as the goal. The second constraint brought up by participants was that practitioners often lack power and access to needed supports like demographic data or the impacted stakeholders and their experiences and opinions. Participant 3 said that they would love to talk to users about their fairness concerns and their experiences, and to understand even their opinions about how they thought fairness should be operationalized. But in practice, it was really hard for them to do a good user study or even a user study at all. And this is in part because it's a huge PR risk to bring users into the process of fairness evaluation. So it's very hard to convince your company to let you do that. And also, even if you do convince them, most of these studies are very small scale because it's qualitative research. So it's hard to convince leadership that the results of these studies are meaningful and generalizable enough to warrant a change in the system. Because of this, practitioners rarely have access to impacted stakeholders when conducting fairness evaluations. One way that the experts in this study described working within this constraint was to do what's called internal red teaming, where you make fake and mock accounts of users that you think might be treated unfairly, and you use your system as one of those users to see if there's any obvious fairness concerns that show up. The last constraint mentioned by the experts in this study was that practitioners often need to get buy-in in order to do fairness work in the first place. Many participants described how fairness work is often considered to run counter to business incentives. So a key way for them to get buy-in was to do, as participant 12 said, fairness evaluations that are tied to the bottom line. For example, this could be done by framing fairness evaluations as a compliance requirement or as something that's good for PR. Another way to get buy-in described by participants was to keep fairness evaluations as simple as possible. Participant 15 said the easier it is to describe and explain a metric, the easier it is to get everyone on board with using it. So all of these business-minded constraints led the participants in this study and lead practitioners generally to do what is called satisficing. This is a combination of the words satisfy and suffice, and it was coined by Herbert Simon. It's a decision-making strategy that seeks a satisfactory or adequate outcome rather than the optimal one. And this journey from these business-minded constraints to this process of satisficing and seeking these satisfactory rather than ideal outcomes, this is what we call pragmatic fairness. And it's one of the major contributions of this work. Pragmatic fairness is really all about being okay with imperfection and striving for a satisfactory approach to fairness evaluation rather than an ideal approach, while recognizing that the ideal approach might not always be possible in the real world. And this brings me to the third research question of this study. How do experts think fairness evaluations can be improved within the practical constraints of industry? And really, this came down to how can we improve pragmatic fairness? I'm going to share 4 examples from participants. The first was to include users more often. And I recognize that I just said that this is not always pragmatically possible. So I will recognize that this is not always going to be the case. But if you do have access to users, several participants in this study said that one way to do it effectively was to make sure that you are providing enough technical details of the system without overwhelming the user with technical details of the system so that they can provide feedback that is useful and usable. The second idea was to evaluate construct validity. This is basically our way of assessing if we are actually measuring the thing that we think that we are measuring. And one participant gave some great ideas of how to do this, such as trying to see what might move a fairness metric up and down, or coming up with ways to undermine our fairness metrics to expose their limitations before we put them into practice. There was also this idea to facilitate citizen panels and assemblies. So this is an idea from political theory where you get a sample of a population together that represents your population of interest. You educate them on an issue and you have them vote on what actions they think should be taken. And one participant said that we could do this for really challenging decisions, like which fairness metric should we choose between each of these equally applicable metrics when they're in tension with one another? Or maybe which of these fairness goals should we prioritize in the event that we can only prioritize one? And finally, the last example was to frame fairness work in a more helpful way. And so this might include, instead of asking your leadership team if you can conduct a fairness evaluation, you might ask, could I conduct an evaluation to see if there are performance disparities between two equally important groups of stakeholders so that we can assess if there's a disparate user satisfaction or user experience to prevent PR concerns? So by being much more specific with that language and not using language like fairness and ethics, you won't scare away leadership and you'll get more buy-in and support from them so that they'll incentivize this work in practice. And one major lesson that I learned from this research study was this tension between idealistic visions of fairness and the pragmatic realities of doing this in the real world. I believe that there is space for both of these approaches in the research community, and I think there needs to be space for both of these approaches. And I'm going to discuss that in just a second. But first, I wanted to summarize the final research question and perspective of this dissertation. What are potential best practices for operationalizing fairness in the real world while keeping practical constraints in mind? My answer is pragmatic fairness. And I recognize that it's not the perfect way to do fairness work, but it does allow us to make incremental progress towards building better systems. So now that I have described all of the studies of this dissertation, I'm going to briefly share my 3 biggest lessons from this work. First, I have learned and relearned over and over and over again in the last 5.5 years that fairness will never be a one-size-fits-all construct. What's fair for me is not what's fair for you. What's fair for you is not what's fair for others, and that is just the nature of this work. Because of this, there is no right or wrong way to measure fairness, and there might be 100 equally good ways to enact fairness in a system, all of which are going to prioritize some people and not others. So my call to action for this is that the research community would greatly benefit from providing more guidance for practitioners to have those hard conversations when there might be several equally good approaches, but they can only choose one, and to facilitate workshops and discussions where they can recognize the trade-offs and consequences of the decisions that they make. My second lesson is that users' perceptions of fairness are not the same as theoretical notions of fairness. And I also think that the research community needs to discuss this tension more. Optimizing a system for theoretical notions of fairness is in some senses easier. You don't have to talk to impacted stakeholders, and you don't have to grapple with the inherently subjective nature of people's lived experiences or their selfishness. However, at the end of the day, if all we are doing is crunching and pushing numbers and people still feel like they are being treated fairly, I think we need to ask, what is the purpose of this work? So my call to action here is for the research community to discuss at greater length how we would operationalize these 2 conceptualizations differently and what the trade-offs of each of those are and what our goals and purpose of evaluating fairness in the first place is. And finally, my last lesson is that I've also learned it is important to strike a balance between working within the system and working to fundamentally change that system. In my final study, I introduced this concept of pragmatic fairness, and I acknowledge that it inherently involves trade-offs. Making mock or fake accounts of users and treating fairness as reactive rather than preventative, these are all ways that we risk exacerbating harm to impacted stakeholders. However, I believe that there is space within the machine learning fairness research community for both these idealistic and pragmatic visions of fairness. I think academics could benefit from recognizing when their critiques are pushing us to do better versus when it might be more helpful for them to guide practitioners in an actionable but imperfect way. I also think that practitioners could benefit from pushing the boundaries of what is possible in an industry setting through things like speculative design, where the purpose is to try to envision possible futures that lie beyond the constraints of the system that we are currently within. So not all work in this field should focus on critiquing and dismantling real-world systems, nor should it overlook the harms that arise from operating within them. To conclude, I was first introduced to machine learning fairness about 7 years ago. At the time, I thought that it was so fascinating that we could quantify a philosophical construct and optimize a machine learning system for this subjective experience. Since then, I have learned that numbers are not everything. I still see the value in attempting to quantify fairness. In fact, I think it's necessary if we want to operationalize it in practice. But I also now know that if our goal is to improve the lived experiences and day-to-day lives of real people, numbers will not get us there alone. Plato said, "A good decision is based on knowledge and not on numbers." And I too believe that in order for us to truly understand fairness and to operationalize it well, we must learn from the stories of those around us. This dissertation is a tribute to those stories. The stories of the people who are treated unfairly by recommender systems and machine learning systems broadly. The stories of the people who have the expertise to alleviate that unfairness. And the stories of the practitioners, the people who are just trying their best day to day to do something that feels probably impossible, to measure the immeasurable. And with that, before I bring this presentation to a close, I wanted to quickly shout out to all my awesome committee members for your guidance, your mentorship, and your support over the last 5.5, almost 6 years. And everybody else on this screen, I wanted to leave names off of here because I mentioned so many in the acknowledgement section of my dissertation that if you want to see your name, it's probably there, so go ahead and read it. And thank you everybody who's on Zoom. Thank you everybody who's here in this room. I could not imagine doing this without all of your support. And with that, I conclude this presentation, open the floor to questions, and that's it. Thank you.